Hi and welcome to F-World, the Fragility podcast. Together with guests from around the world, we explore how fragility manifests across economics, politics, security, culture, development, and the environment, and how we can build a more resilient world together. We are your hosts. My name is Johan Bjurman Bergman, and I'm joined by my colleagues Mihaela Karste and Paul Biska. And today, we are speaking to Scott Guggenheim. Scott is an anthropologist by training and one of the originators of community-driven development, a model that gives poor people more agency in how development decisions are made. Working for the World Bank for over 20 years, Scott built his reputation as a maverick with a laser-sharp focus on making sure that local knowledge and local voices were heard all the way to the top of the hierarchy. While at the bank, Scott played a central role in assessing development projects' negative effects on poor people and developing policy guidelines that went beyond the greatest good for the greatest numbers and incorporated human rights considerations in a better way. Driven by his belief in the power of communities, he also founded the Kecamatan Development Program in Indonesia, the very first community-driven development program to be funded by the World Bank, covering more than 34,000 villages. He then went on to work as the senior advisor for the President of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, where he helped set up the scaffolding for the Afghan state following the 2001 US invasion. And in Afghanistan, he also created the National Solidarity Program, a community-driven development program covering over 38,000 communities. Scott is also a mentor and was my professor at Georgetown, and we're very glad to have him with us today. Welcome to the F-World podcast, Scott.
Thank you, Johan. A little flowery introduction.
Yeah, I hope it's not too much, but we're excited to have you with us and to explore your background and your thoughts on development. So we figured we would start from the beginning. You were born in New York City, and now you're in Indonesia, and having lived there for quite some years. What have been the formative experiences of your life that took you from where you grew up to working on community development and development across the globe? Share some of those with us and your journey.
Well, it was pretty straightforward. For what it's worth, I was, as you might imagine, a pretty rebellious little kid. And so when I was 12 years old, I saved up a lot of money from a paper route and went to Mexico. And spent 6 months in Mexico wandering around, which is where I learned Spanish, and loved working there. So when I turned 17, I went back to Mexico for a while, and I worked in the Iberoamericana and the National Museum of Anthropology, which was one of the great areas of community development, community studies overall. So by the time I got to grad school, I sort of already had the basic framework of thinking about communities like we talked about in our classes. Not so much as collections of individual traits inside a village, but as social organizations that are part of much bigger historical and sociological kind of currents. So I came to the bank with that perspective. And when I got out to Indonesia in 1995, late 1994, a lot of what I was thinking about at the time was, what can we do anything with that approach to communities? My professor as an undergraduate was a fellow named Eric Wolf, who by coincidence, as a grad student, had written an essay comparing community structures in Central Java with community structures in Mexico. So it seemed almost like a natural jump to start looking at community studies when I got to Indonesia. And then we did some black box studies on what's going on inside communities, where the big challenge turned out to be, when you have all this knowledge of how communities work and how they vary, can the tools of national development be adapted so that you can do things with them? And that's how it all got started. It was a pretty straightforward line of Mexico and Mexican Latin American studies having an influence on at least my approach to thinking about Southeast Asian studies, where in Southeast Asia, much of the social science had been driven by the Vietnam War, rather than that sort of endogenous notion of how do we think about localized kind of development. So the blessing, in a way, in a very sad way, was the 1998 crisis, where the whole development edifice collapsed. And people were desperate, looking for ways that you could still get support into what they thought was going to be sort of famine, large-scale population movements, lots of violence. And by working directly with communities, you could still go forward, even though most of the development infrastructure had disappeared in the collapse of the Suharto government. So that was the original origin for that kind of work. And I just wanted to correct one thing, is that, and I've written about this, is that what we did with the community development wasn't as new as people think it is, right? There was a lot of bricolage, of pulling together bits from other kinds of programs, including some of Indonesia's own programs that were bits on how to do community-based engineering, or how do you do local level planning, or how do you get financial transfers. So what we did was assemble things that were understood by the Indonesian bureaucracy, right? And the most bottom part, there's nothing there that someone from Oxfam would find unfamiliar. The challenge is, how do you do that with public policy in a developing country on a very large scale? And that was the innovation, was putting it all together into a single package rather than any one element of the package.
So Scott, what do you think that your background in anthropology gave you that, let's say, your peers who were trained more as economists or development professionals or standard degrees, what do you think it gave you relative to them? How did that help you navigate all these very different environments that you worked in?
Well, there were two sides to it, right? So remember, this was happening at the very first movements on the green movement around the world. So the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit at the time. And what I was looking at for my PhD, I had gone to the Philippines where they were building, this was under martial law at the time, where they were building very large hydro dams in the north of the Philippines. And that's where I was doing my field work. And I could see some of the terrible effects that the dam reconstruction was having on the villages where I was doing my PhD. And that was because in the highland part, they were trying to force communities to leave so they could take over the land. And it was so bad that at one point the Philippine Air Force was strafing the indigenous communities. And those are communities where there were marriage exchanges between the villages where I was working in the lowlands, and we would go on these long marches up to the highlands and see these bombed out villages. So I found out that this was being financed by the World Bank. So when I was starting my write-up, I thought it'd be pretty interesting to see what did the bank actually know about all of this. And of course, they knew nothing at all. Right? It was pretty much a large-scale civil war going on in the north of the Philippines. The bank's financing it, and they had never left Manila. Right? So they had all these assurances from the government. So while I'm writing, I don't know what degree you guys are all working on, but you'll know that no matter what your fellowship was, you're bankrupt while you're trying to write a thesis on it. So I was doing part-time teaching out in New Jersey, but the cost of getting to the teaching site was higher than what I was getting paid to do it. So I knew this wasn't going to be very sustainable. So eventually I called every single classmate I knew and said, there got to be something out there that would be useful by way of a job. And the person I called at the World Bank said, I hate this job. If you want it, it's yours. Right? So that's when I went down for an interview in Washington, D.C., which I completely screwed up. And at the end of it, a Romanian sociologist there named Michael Chernia asked me, so what do you think of Henry Kissinger? And figuring I had already blown the interview, I said, well, I think he's a war criminal who should spend the rest of his life in jail. And at that point, figuring I had lost the job, right, he then calls me back and says he doesn't agree with me, but the fact that I would say what I thought was enough to get the job going. And so what we started to do, he was the leader in thinking about the World Bank's resettlement policy, but he gave me for free rein to wander through the files and see how many more projects there were like that Philippine project. And it turned out there were a lot. So we wrote up a review of 25 big World Bank programs that were causing resettlement, and they all had pretty much the same story of large-scale human rights violations, not following the World Bank's own policies. And I left to do a postdoc in South America, but he followed up on that and turned it into this big, high-level cause at the very senior-most part of the bank's management that would say that we're financing all this big infrastructure and not paying attention to the impacts. Now, it ties back to the Earth Summit because the activist NGOs at the same time were picking up on the same themes and talking about the very damaging side effects of development, largely with things like deforestation in Brazil and Indonesia, but also on the human fallout from these big infrastructure models, and saying that the entire model is fractured. So you had external pressure, internal reviews, And I got called back from South America to go look at some more dams. And this was in Somalia for the first one I went to. At that point, they decided, let's take a look at the whole portfolio and see what a mess there actually is here. And so that was really Chernia who brought in other social scientists. When he was there, he was actually originally the only one. By I think about 1980, I think there were three. So Gloria Davis, who worked in transmigration, Marita Hochwezer, who worked in the Amazon, and one or two more. And then I came in a little bit later. So I was part of the original 10 who came in. And in our area, we focused a lot on involuntary resettlement. And you essentially can't do that without talking about impacts on communities. And so when this blew up at a very high policy level and as a cause around the world, and that's thanks to a lot of the green NGOs, part of the answer is we're going to have to hire more social scientists to deal with these social impact type of problems. So that was the entry ticket. Then when I came out to Indonesia, it was to try and clean up the mess that one of these big dams had caused in central Java. And I went out there, it was just hopeless. There was nothing to reconstruct. They had closed the doors of a dam with 35,000 people still inside the reservoir area. So the army had gone in, it was a total mess. So we made some half-hearted efforts to mitigate what was possible, and not very much was possible. At the same time, I got started looking at there was some suspicion inside the government that the great Indonesia success story wasn't all it was cracked up to be. So I had been working with a political scientist named Robert Putnam on looking at concepts of social capital around the world. And we started we picked 3 countries to be core pilots for an in-depth look at social capital metrics. So Bolivia, Burkina Faso, and Indonesia. So while I was wasting time trying to repair this horrible dam, we also ran these studies out across 3 parts of Indonesia, looking at are there ways to measure the amount of social capital and ways that you might think about using it for development. That study was supported by a absolutely brilliant transport financial analyst who was a total sort of square peg in a round hole, who didn't really fit into bank thinking, but she was a brilliant financial analyst. And she also thought that this issue of never consulting people and just doing top-down development wasn't the right way to go. So as we're doing those studies that are looking at different forms of community organizing, is when the East Asia crisis hit. So we had just been turning those social capital studies into a very, very, very small pilot program when the entire development structure was sort of swept away like by a giant wave. And so we made a sort of bold proposition, thanks to this financial analyst, that said that we think this can be scaled up. And it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't entirely original. The Indonesians have been trying to figure out how to deal with their corrupt middle-level bureaucracy and had been starting to transfer and decentralize a bit more. So we were able to build it up out of pieces to do a pilot program. But thanks to the desperation sort of everybody felt, it went from being a program for 48 villages into one for about 2,000 in just a couple of months. And then because it was able to do 2,000, we could do quite a bit more. So those were the entry points. It was a combination of looking at communities through the involuntary resettlement lens, the social capital studies that were going on there, and that East Asia crisis, which sort of opened up the door for trying something a little bit new.
So, Scott, we've already seen a pattern in some of the things we've been discussing. There is a crisis and then there's innovation. You've mentioned the East Asian financial crisis and how that led to the birth of CDD. We've also seen more recently with refugees that until the Syrian crisis of 2015, this was mostly a humanitarian issue. Until the development approach to forced displacement took hold as a response to this crisis. Do you think that crises in general and the inevitable toll of human suffering are a necessary evil for innovation to happen in development?
No, of course not. I just think that for things that involve deep institutional commitments, you need something to convince them that trying something new is better than just doing more of the same, right? So it's not all, this isn't an iron law that there has to be a crisis, but a crisis does help, right? And the reason is no great theoretical reason. It's because in development, what people tend to leave out are all the institutional incentives that operate. And what happens when in a normal development setup is it takes so long to get a development project started that once it's started, people want to keep doing it. So when we were doing this in Indonesia, I think they were doing irrigation 23. right? These things can go on forever. And when you look at education programming or health program, people are trying to build very big institutional delivery systems, and thousands of people get invested in doing more of the same. So you need to be able to say, why would I change that for something that's been untested or unknown? It takes a lot to convince people to break that. So I'll give you a counter example. I think JPAL, the randomized controlled trial people based out of MIT and Harvard, have been doing brilliant work out here for a long time on why food transfers are less efficient than doing cash transfers. So Ben Oken, who I worked with for many years, started this as a grad student, right? And he shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's a really inefficient and corrupt way to do food transfers, and it'd be much more efficient to give cash transfers. So I knew him, and he's a young grad student. He's now a senior professor at MIT, and he's still writing the same paper, trying to convince the Indonesian government that you're losing billions of dollars every year by doing cash transfers, by doing food transfers, when you could be doing cash transfers. And bit by bit, he's chipping away at it. You now have a constituency inside the government, but the politics of the food subsidies and food transfer would mean thousands upon thousands of people have to do something entirely different, and it might even go to an entirely different ministry. So why would they possibly agree to doing this? It then becomes a matter of political will, right? So you don't need a crisis for that. He's chipping away at it bit by bit, incremental change. But for something like what we were trying to do, having a crisis really did open the door, because there was no natural home, right, in this very top-down development model for something that's much more bottom-up and participatory. So we needed the crisis, but not everybody does.
So Scott, since it's not always possible to have a crisis on hand that can open that door to meaningful change within government and within development approaches, could you talk a little bit more about the barriers and the counterforces to incremental change, both within government, within development institutions? And I'm thinking here about the example you gave on the food versus cash transfers. That is ultimately a let's say, call it technical problem that can be addressed through a technical solution. However, in practice, it ends up being a matter of political will. And any departure from how things are done may depend only slightly on the quality of the research. So can you talk more about what other forces are at work to keep less effective systems in their place?
Well, I think there's several, right? So first of all, I wouldn't overweight how brilliant all these economists are, because it becomes a very self-referential kind of system. And I'll give you a real good example, right? You know, there's a huge controversy about the poverty line, right? That is to say, what you focus on with a lot of social protection systems is targeting. How do I make sure that most of the money, all the money, is going to people below the poverty line, and none of the money is going to people above the poverty line, right? It's almost like a religious dogma right now, that accurate targeting is key for social protection and cash transfers. Now, villagers don't see it that way, right? And there's reasons why they don't see it that way. First of all, that you never actually know what people's real income and expenditure is. So they use proxies, right? That's what a proxies mean test actually is. So you'll look at the quality of the roof. Do they have a television? Do they eat 3 meals a day? And out of that, you're making your best guess on how much money they actually have. That has some pretty big flaws at the margins, right? One of which is, let's say you're a woman in a house that's a very nice house. Your husband is an industrialist, and he suddenly drops dead, right? So on a proxy means test, you have a nice house, right? You have no source of income, so you're way below the poverty line, and you get excluded from all these cash transfers. That's the first thing that happens. Second thing that happens is that villagers will say, I don't quite get it. How come somebody who makes $1.79 a day is able to get a cash transfer, but someone who makes $1.81 a day is not, right? That is to say, they don't really see why this matters. So from a poverty targeting side, they're absolutely right. From a social solidarity side, they're absolutely wrong, right? People will say that what you started to do is take an American model of individualism and destroy our notion of community solidarity, that everybody should get something. And when we look at what's wrong with that the food transfer program, a lot of what they're calling corruption is actually leakage above the poverty line. People who say that just because poor people need some basic food, it doesn't mean other people shouldn't get something. They don't get the same amount, but villagers will hand out food because they think there's real value to the social solidarity. So that's the second big reason. The third is is that the targeting systems depend on having accurate registers of who's eligible and who's not. Well, look what just happened under COVID, right? In normal times, you can do a survey and measure everybody's proxy means test and build up a data registry that's more or less accurate. COVID comes around and they find out that massive numbers of people lost their jobs because there's no more demand. They go back to the communities, but they're not on the lists, right? How are you supposed to target them? All your micro enterprises, your push carts selling food, people who are cleaning the mosques, all of those just lost their job. None of them are on the list, and your entire social targeting system is predicated on having a national registry that you can make the cash transfer to, right? So what people look at as well is the different metric on when does this system make sense versus some other system. So that's the conceptual part. The practical part is what I was saying earlier, is that you've built up huge institutional and political interests in why, in buying the food, distributing the food, measuring the food, and it would be a different ministry that does the cash transfer. So it takes an awful lot of political courage and political will to say, let's just cancel this program that's been around for 40 years, right? Everyone thought, in 1979, everyone thought it was a great success. The fact that we're in 2020 and it's way out of date, that doesn't change the fact that an entire political party is running this thing, and you're going to have to convince them that they're going to give up power one way or the other and give it to somebody else. But like I said, I would, the institutional things I think are the fundamental reason, but I also wouldn't overweight how brilliant all this research is versus a lot of practical knowledge on it actually has many flaws.
Yeah, no, and it's so important, as you say, to not overweight that. But also then another thing then is how do you translate the insights from the social research, from the anthropological insights, and make that palatable and understandable to economists? I know we have discussed before, and you've mentioned in your work on resettlement that some of these utilitarian economists came in with the argument of saying, it's all about the greatest good for the largest number of people, and then it's difficult to have even a conversation about resettlement because it's such a blanket argument. So how do you counter those types of utilitarian arguments that may be perfectly reasonable but doesn't reflect the full picture of the situation and make it more nuanced?
So I think a couple of points on that, right? And I don't want to turn economists into the punching bags, because I think that it's a pretty varied discipline as well. And you do have this gap between sort of bureaucratic economists who are justifying a certain development model versus real economists who actually do care about a lot of these issues. So it's been interesting to see in the past 3 or 4 years, the number of senior economists at central banks coming out with speeches on the importance of bringing community back into macroeconomic models. So Mark Carney, who was the head of the central bank in the UK as well as Canada, right, gave a big speech on this. I have one I can send you from Ben Bernanke, nobody's idea of an anthropologist, right, talking about if we don't understand community and the variance in communities, we're never going to solve poverty in the United States. Raghuresh Rajan, who was the head of the Planning Commission and also an IMF chief economist, has written an entire book called The Third Pillar, which is all about community and development. So your hardcore macroeconomists sort of get this, that markets don't regulate themselves as much as we thought they do. And there is a need for thinking about bottom-up, participatory, social capital-driven type of things versus this sort of Reagan-Thatcher model that everything is fixed by the market and hyper-individualism. So I just think that entire ideology is sort of going out of date. Not enough, but it's still sort of heading out at the sort of conceptual level is what you're asking about. At a more practical level, I think there's a lot of work to do, both on the analytics and on the operational side. On the analytics side, some of this is just translation. Right? One of the oldest ideas in anthropology is that in sub-Saharan Africa, the countries or tribes that are organized by kinship, so grandparents, parents, children, right, actually have a very different logic than ones that are organized by age sets, where everybody who's a youth becomes part of one group, people who are much older become a different group. Well, a study just came out showing that social protection, the cash transfer idea, right, it actually works very well in kinship-based societies and fails totally in age-set societies. And the reason is everyone sort of assumed there'd be spillovers, that grandparents will give food to their grandchildren, but in age-set societies they don't do that, right? So and this was done by, I think, by an MIT group recently. They suddenly found out that social organization matters. Now, anthropologists have known that all their sources are from the 1920s and 1930s, right? So they've known this for a long time, but they couldn't translate it into economic language, right? And so the question is always going to be, well, you study 5 villages, but there's 5,000 villages. How do I know that it's representative, right? Or you have a lot of statements from people, but they're all anecdotes. I need to see a quantitative regression or a causal model here. So this is where I think that we suffer from the way both disciplines have been institutionalized. The easy answer for that is, why don't you get anthropologists and economists to work together? And the best programs are doing that. By and large, there's almost no incentive for an academic to work with another discipline, whether that's in the development institutions, but especially not in academia. So since these days, everybody comes with a PhD when they work at the World Bank or at the IMF, right? They've already been trained not to cooperate with anybody else, right? And that wasn't really true a long time ago when you had much more mixed teams because they had practical problems to solve, right? If you were working on transmigration in Indonesia, you actually needed agronomists, engineers, water specialists, and so on. And now you don't really have those mixed teams anymore, right? Everyone has their own sector and their own specialty, and they try and keep everything within that bureaucratic bit of turf, right? So to answer your question in a practical way, first of all, you have to show that you can turn it into something that large-scale public policy can do something with, right? Either positive or negative. So showing that social transfers to age-based systems isn't going to achieve your goal of better nutrition or better health. Starts off opening a conversation that, if that doesn't work, what might work, right? The second part is that even if anthropologists, and it's not the only discipline around, has some good insights about how social structure affects development, you do need the economists to turn this into causal model and empirical tests and get some sense of, before I ask a government to risk $10 billion on a new way of doing things, I better be sure that I'm right, and it's not just the 20 villages that the anthropologists studied, right? So my answer to a lot of your question is interdisciplinarity rather than saying one is right and the other is wrong. What I think what anthropologists bring to this discussion in the past has always been fieldwork, right? That they're actually out in the villages and in the communities and so on. And I think of that as an epistemological issue, not an empirical one or a methodological one. That's to say, you're getting the local person's point of view, and you're looking at the tail end of the system to see how the system really works. And that's really important in development because there's a lot of incentive issues built into how statistics get gathered, how they get defined and how they get gathered. And everybody has an incentive to report that things are better than they actually are, right? So understanding how poor people are accessing some of these big programs is as much an intellectual challenge as it is an empirical measurement question on who counts. And if you start looking, this is where I think feminist economics has brought a lot to this discussion, just the feminist movement, looking at definitions. And when you see all these big surveys, who actually is the head of the family, right? In big parts of Indonesia, many Afghanistan, where I work a lot also, it's impossible for a woman to be the head of a family, even if in practical terms she is, right? So they always put like the husband's brother as the head of the family, and people assume there's an intra-household transfer going on, even though every measurement shows that there isn't, right? That a widow's children are not going to be fed as well. They are going to be stunted, but all the statistics show they're fine. Right, so this is where that investigative approach of what the anthropologist brings on how the system really works adds something to a lot of the formal tools. Now, it's interesting. There, 3 days ago was the birthday of Albert Hirschman, who I think is one of the founding saints of development anthropology, and it was a weird article because it starts talking about how randomized controlled trials actually were something very derived from Albert Hirschman, which they definitely were not, right? But the reason they thought that, right, was because this forced economists to get out of the laboratories and the classrooms and actually go out and measure in the field. So I sent the article off to a couple of the world's sort of top people who work on RCTs, and I said, do you agree with this? And they said, absolutely. The big value of what RCTs has brought to economics is that you have to go out to the field and measure. And I think that's true also. So and that's why I've always worked well with a lot of the RCT people, even though I know the critiques and I agree with a lot of the critiques. The fact that they go out to the field, they learn the language, they spend time validating at a very empirical level, to me is what a good social scientist does.
So you mentioned that we really suffer from the way anthropology and economics have been institutionalized and the fact that there's no incentive to work with one another. And you also said that it wasn't always this way. When I look back at grad school, at just overall my academic training, I see the disciplinary boundaries being drawn much, much earlier, even before us as professionals ever reach institutions. So, and I can't help but thinking that if we train students to have deep but very narrow expertise, we end up either with a lack of shared language or maybe with shared language that means something completely different. Either way, we can't talk to one another. And ultimately, effective development programs require the ability to translate across disciplines. They require us to be able to communicate. And unfortunately, the way incentives, the current incentive present in higher education, introduce what is ultimately a degree of fragility in the very same institutions that aim to solve problems that are inherently cross-disciplinary. So it would be great to hear your thoughts about the role of education, especially higher education, and the way it's structured and how it ends up creating this environment where people have little to no incentive to work with one another.
Well, I entirely agree with you, right? Even in the bank, I kept saying to myself, right, that when you meet some of these super narrow, very rigid economists there, it turns out most of them had only been there for 6 months or a year. They came straight from being a professor at some university. And the older ones who had been there longer and had to solve real-world problems were a lot more open to the idea of interdisciplinarity, right? So I think you're entirely on the right track that it has to start a lot earlier. There's a couple of different questions that come up with that. You know that statistically, it turns out that a certain personality type likes to go to economics, right? That the individual maximizer is naturally drawn to the field, and people with a more empathetic or a sort of socially oriented attitude sort of don't do all that well in economics. Now, I don't, so it turns out to be statistically true, but I don't really know how relevant that all is, right? But I do find it entertaining. So I do think that what you're saying, I think the root problem has tended to be more and more that as the disciplines get more and more technical, people feel they don't have the time or the incentive to work in a more cross-disciplinary way. And what's been happening in the development agencies, which is just the mirror image of all of this, is that there's less and less frontline engagement on what you do in project work. And it's much more now about the kind of analytics and high-level analytics that the development agencies are asking for. And that reduces the incentive for interdisciplinarity. But if you're asking me, do I think I think they're going way off track by going that route. And it's much better to have, I always thought that was what attracted me to development instead of academia, was that you have to work with foresters and engineers and people who know things that you don't. I always thought that was the joy of working in development teams on that, right? And in fragile states, you're going to see this in spades. I just had to review the World Bank's, what do you call it again, the fragility assessment for Afghanistan, where they're citing these national poverty figures, right? Now, and they're all built out of household expenditure. Right? And the numbers don't make any sense, right? It has it at 35% one year, 72% the next year, 57% the year after that. And said not only do numbers not vary that much on things like poverty unless there's been a giant drought or some other kind of crisis, but I said on top of that, half the country is controlled by Taliban. Do you really think that government enumerators are going into those areas with a clipboard and a government uniform and saying, how much did you spend on wheat last week? Right? You know they're making up those numbers. Right, so it's not that the numbers are entirely wrong, but I wouldn't build an entire model of how to work on development in Afghanistan out of models that are so rubbery, right? And I think you see a lot of this. And I gave you the example before that the way women enter national statistical systems should be the first point of challenge, not the first point of acceptance for thinking about these things. And there's many more areas like that. In Latin America, the big revolution of the past 10 years has been the discovery that there's such a thing as Afro-Latinos. Right, that the sort of black descending populations of Mexico and the Caribbean, the Pacific littoral, actually are black. Right now, they didn't change color; they've always been there. It wasn't until somebody did a poverty assessment in the 1980s or 90s, I can't remember what it was, and they were finally able to introduce a tag. And it turns out, big surprise, that poverty numbers are disproportionately high in the black majority parts of Latin America. And in some places like Mexico, for the first time, the president is admitting that there is a large Afro-Mexican population, and they're going to need compensatory policies for that. Now, Latin America has had more macroeconomic modeling than probably any place in the developing world, and yet none of those statistics had ever thought of this before. So like I said, it's not that I'm criticizing it. I just think that you want to be constantly challenging the quality of the data and the concepts behind the data before you start making these very big policy prescriptions.
Definitely, but it's very interesting. Then, is there because there are such challenges in collecting data, and particularly in fragile countries from communities, what are the gains perhaps that a model like community-driven development can create the other way around, so to speak? Are there gains where the CDD programs can help inform policy? Are there mechanisms by which they can also have we can build kind of a virtuous cycle using them, particularly in countries where, as you say, perhaps there is an insurgent group controlling large swaths of land?
Sure. Well, yes, of course. So you need a couple of things to do that, right? So at the conceptual level, I think you actually need to decide that where do you want your errors to be, right? And a big problem, say, in social protection is, are you more worried about inclusion error, or are you more worried about exclusion error, right? And a lot of your poverty targeting people are much more worried about inclusion error, which is that people who shouldn't be getting it are getting it, right? Whereas if you had a more European background, you'd be much more worried about people who should have gotten it, didn't get it. What that leads you to, and this is part of our argument out here in Indonesia, so I'm going to try and translate everything into economics for you, right? So the first thing it's leading to is, do you want to have self-targeting systems or not, right? Or basically demand-based kind of targeting systems. And this is why COVID was really illuminating that way, where they had invested heavily in making sure there's no inclusion error by using a centralized database for targeting. So a big national survey in 2016, if you're on that list, you get the cash transfer. If you're not on the list, you don't get it. But then we have COVID come in, and it turns out huge numbers of people you wanted to get it, right, can't get it. So they proposed, why don't you let the local authorities decide that who came back, who wasn't on the list, but deserves it anyway because they're starving to death, right? And you had this huge pushback saying that you're going to wreck our national data registry. And fortunately, the government said, well, screw that. We got to get this stuff out here, or we're going to have violence in the countryside. So they introduced self-targeting through the community development programs. And in 6 weeks, they found 8 million households who had been missed by the national transfer system, right? So that would be a first example where actually it made a really big difference at the back end on whether you open it up for those kinds of concepts or not, right? So targeting is one really big area. Anything that involves demand side management, right, is going to need a CDD type of approach, right? Places where there are policy ways to do a lot of this, but you also need a lot more feedback on what's working and how do you get. I think Lant Pritchett's written quite a bit on this. On certain kinds of services require local knowledge, and certain kinds require technical knowledge. So you can manage a central bank with 5 people, right? You look at money supply, it goes up, it goes down. But you certainly can't do local education service delivery that way. You have thousands of teachers who need to have the right incentives operating. And this is why they set up all these parent-teacher associations and school boards and community boards to work with teachers. At that end, 5 people will achieve absolutely nothing. You need to have things where whole communities are working with the education, the parents, the teachers, the principals, and so on, if you want to get better quality education. So I think it's this mix of the endogenous factors of the sector that you're trying to work at, right, with this balance between sort of supply-driven service delivery and demand-based knowledge, and that getting that formula right is how you get better development out of these big services. It's not that anthropology is right or economics is right. I think the problem you're trying to solve has to get defined differently, and then you think, what skills do I need in this place to do it? And I don't think you need community development for everything. You don't want heart surgeons being done at the village level. Mao tried this already, right? But I also think that we have such a record of failures at sort of poverty service delivery from sectors that are trying to do it with that post-World War II giant technical delivery model, which can work in some areas. Highly centralized, wealthy countries, it works fine, right? And I always laugh whenever England is trying to convince people to decentralize, because they don't decentralize at all. But in most countries, right, that's not the case. They don't have the technical capacities, and we keep trying to pretend that they do, when a more partnership model would be just much more effective.
So you just said that we don't need community-driven development for everything. Can you talk more about the limits of CDD? I'm asking, for instance, in my own work on security risk management in West Africa, one of the phrases often heard is that the community will take care of the security around a particular project, where in reality, sometimes the perpetrators of violence are actually community self-defense militias. So what are the limits of CDD in your view, and what are some of the environments in which it actually doesn't work?
Yeah, sure. I entirely agree with you. One of the things that's been a little annoying to watch over time is what was meant as a tool, right? One of many tools that we have in the development kit has turned into a bit of a religious movement among the proponents, right? That no matter what the problem is, community development is going to solve it, right? And that's wrong on several counts. One is the one you already point out, which is that communities actually can't do everything. They're heterogeneous. They have a lot of weakened systems and so on. But they're also wrong on first principles, right? That no development strategy is ever going to succeed in raising incomes very far if all it does is community development, right? And so anything that would be economically transformational kind of investment, industrialization, urbanization, that's not what CDD is set up for. That comes down, in my view, for what it's worth, right, to the difference between having an economic development strategy and having economic development tools, right? And what people get obsessed with is the tool and not the strategy, right? And so this has to, again, due to the incentives. If you're a project officer in the bank, for example, just give you an example, you're rewarded for having a CDD project. You're not rewarded for having a strategy that has CDD, health, education, agriculture. Each of those has a different sector and a different task manager, and they never cooperate, right? In theory, there's a country director, I think, is supposed to be doing that, but it doesn't happen. Everyone has their own project. And people get very obsessed with the turf, with the budget around that. But let me get back to some of the specifics. So what community development is for is, first of all, you have to make an empirical assessment of just how strong are those community structures. In Indonesia, it's really high. Every measurement shows that. It leads every single global survey, like the Pew Value survey, on measures of any kind of social solidarity. It's actually funny because you're from Romania, but next door to you, right, you have Indonesia tops the global list on sort of social capital and optimism kind of variables, and Bulgaria anchors the list. Right? That no matter what it is, they're going to say they don't like it. Right. And so what that means is that Indonesians overweight just how successful they are in terms of solidarity, and East Europe underweights what they're able to do. So you need some empirical assessment of just, how much cooperation, how well do these systems work? They're not the same as they were 100 years ago. There's so much more demographic change, technological change, new opportunity horizons that a lot of people in rural communities don't want to be in a rural community. So I do think you have to get some assessment of how realistic is it to expect collective action at a community level and how much scope for action it actually has. So I'd start there, right? Then you start looking at all the things you're talking about. In many areas, you have negative social capital, right? There's gangs, there's drug lords that are there. They're able to cooperate with each other, but not for particularly good social purposes, right? So you got to look at those kinds of questions also. But the big question for me always is the one I think one of you two started off asking from the very beginning is, there's a lot known about how to do assessments of community cooperation, patterns of participation. It's that engagement with the state that's the problem, right? Or the challenge. Can you work it out so that money that's sitting in a national capital actually reaches the ones that are at a decision-making level at the local level? And when is the right time to be doing that, right? And that's what we've been talking about, is that for many things, it's not the right answer, or it's part of a right answer, but you have to work out, is it actually going to get there, right? And so, there's a pretty good study in East Africa that showed how they opened up the community transfer. They tried to use a community model, and they would transfer money to villages, but they could only buy services from the ministry that gave them the money. Right? Of course, what this led to was wildly inefficient and wildly corrupt kinds of systems, where it was a design question. It was no big empirical issue. It was a really crappy design because they hadn't worked through the financial flows of how does money get from one end of that system to the other. So I just come back to my basic point is it's a tool. It's like saying, do you like your hammers or do you not like your hammers? Well, if you're trying to drive in a nail, a hammer's great. If you're trying to open a jar, it's not so great. So, and that's how I think about community development is the assessment of when is it the right thing to be doing. And if you've made that first determination, then you get into this question of how do I actually make it work? So nothing terribly conceptual. It seemed to me pretty straightforward, but it rarely happens that way.
Scott, I want to go back to the importance of understanding the strength of community structures before using a tool such as CDD as part of a strategy. You also mentioned the fact that Eastern Europe ranks very low on variables like social capital and optimism, thus, in a way, underweighting what it can actually do. From my own experience, most of the programs I have seen in Romania, and I'm most familiar with EU programs, these programs do little to no tailoring for the country's values. And that is important because, for example, from sources like the World Values Survey and other research, what really stands out about Romania is the deep lack of trust among the population. So much so, in fact, that it makes the country stand apart from its peers at the same income level or development level. So how do these economic development programs integrate this kind of information in their design? Do they use data, for example, from sources like the World Values Survey?
Yeah, they always look at the World Values Survey. It's like all the, these are very good, very macro data sets, but there's a lot of variance within any one country, right? Now, but my general sense, and you got to be careful about overgeneralizing on these kinds of statements, right, is that the entire post-Soviet belt, right, is actually bad for CDD, right? Stalin did a good thing winning World War II, but boy, was he effective at destroying social solidarity pretty much everywhere they stepped, right? And this day, whether it's Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, right, the former Soviet Union, I don't think CDD is ever going to work very well, at least not for a long, 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 long time, if it ever were to come back at all. Right now, within that though, it's not that you can't. It's what people try to do that I've seen that I don't like either is copy the Indonesia model instead of coming up with more situationally appropriate models. So if you look at the EU, for example, one of their biggest programs actually is transferring to community and local government work in Hungary and I think Romania also. Whether that works or not, I didn't actually see any assessment. They keep talking about how they're doing it and it seems to be relatively successful, but I am sure it looks nothing like what it does in Indonesia, Philippines, or Afghanistan. That local government will be much more in charge of the kind of service delivery. So to me, the question's more along the lines of, it's not community per se, it's about where decision-making sits on a lot of the key questions, and some of those may be at a local government level, some may be at an informal community level where government is very weak, and some may be very high up. So again, it becomes more empirical rather than from a priori kind of deductions.